They laughed when he asked for his wrench back. 5 minutes later, one of them was dead, and the wrench was buried in his throat like it had always belonged there. Jace Keller hadn't meant to kill anyone, not that day. But the moment the Vorten guard chuckled and kicked the steel wrench down the grated floor, something inside Jace snapped louder than any bone ever could. He hadn't touched a weapon since Oath fell. He was a mechanic, not a soldier. A fixer, not a fighter. But even the nicest wrench turns violent when survival's the job. They had taken him from his garage, midworld, dirty gloves still on. The whole thing had felt like a hallucination, except the cuffs burned too hot, and the alien fists left real bruises. There was no trial, no reason, no translator. Just a sack over his head, gravity that made his guts twist, and the smell of metal oil in an alien cargo hold. They brought him to a room that stank of Scotch bone and coolant. The walls were sweat dark, smeared with old fluids and newer blood. 3 Vortens stood over him, each one armored in plated carapace and smug grins that didn't need a shared language to be understood. One pushed him into a chair with all the delicacy of slamming a bag of meat onto a butcher's table. Another pointed at a cracked energy drill and barked something garbled. Jace didn't speak Vorten, but he got the message. Fix it, or bleed. Probably both. He stared at the smoking drill. It was a mess. Circuitry scorched, the stabilizer coil looked melted, and the power cell was leaking a faint blue glow that usually meant approach only if suicidal. The kicker? He'd built something almost identical on Earth. The bastards weren't just capturing humans, they were stealing Earth's tech and slapping alien stickers on it like they invented it. The 3rd Vorten noticed Jace looking at the tray of tools. He stepped forward, grinning wider than any jaw had a right to stretch, and picked up the wrench. The handle was scratched, but Jace saw it, his mark. A carved smiley face near the grip, made by a soldering pen on a slow Tuesday back in Colorado. The alien turned it in his hands, then dropped it. It clattered across the floor, echoed down the hall, and disappeared beneath a vent panel. Jace looked at the guard. The guard smiled. Fix. Now, the Vorten said in broken English. Jace didn't know whether to be impressed or insulted. He rubbed his wrists, noting the lock type on the cuffs. Magnetic. That meant the keys weren't physical. They were digital, maybe even neural linked to the armor. No way out through force alone. He'd have to play it quiet. For now. Jace moved toward the broken drill, kneeling beside it as if humbled. He let his fingers work through the casing with trained ease, noting where the fake components had been wedged into the Oath-built core. They didn't even wire it properly. The arrogance of these creatures. They thought they were smarter, faster, more advanced. Maybe they were. But they weren't better. He palmed a filament wire from inside the device and coiled it quickly into a loop around his thumb. It wasn't a weapon yet. But give him time. The guards turned away, arguing about something. Probably what to do with him after the fix, dump the body, or sell it for spare parts. Either way, he wasn't planning to stay long enough to find out. Hours passed. Or maybe minutes. Time stretched in that room. Eventually, the drill sparked, coughed, then hummed to life. Jace rose slowly, stretching like he had just woken from a long nap. One guard approached and tested the drill. It worked. The guard barked laughter and clapped the others on the shoulder. Then he backhanded Jace across the face. Not hard. Just enough to remind him who was in charge. Jace tasted blood, copper, and grit. He smiled through it. The guards laughed again. That was when the lights flickered. Just once. It was enough. Jace lunged, diving toward the vent where his wrench had disappeared. The guards turned too late. His fingers found the steel handle like it had been waiting. One Vorten reached him first. Jace didn't hesitate. He spun, drove the wrench upward, and felt the crunch through bone and cartilage. The Vorten staggered, clawing at its throat, gurgling as black blood poured from between its fingers. The other 2 rushed. Jace ducked, rolled under the table, then flipped it into one. Tools scattered, slamming into the floor with deafening clangs. The 3rd Vorten fired, but the shot hit the table. Jace came up behind him, wrapped the filament wire around the alien's arm, and yanked it tight. Armor hissed and bent. Jace grabbed the alien's blaster, aimed without thinking, and fired point blank. The last Vorten dove into the hallway, shrieking into a communicator. Jace didn't follow. He turned and looked at the carnage, chest heaving. Blood on the floor, the drill sparking behind him, the wrench in his hand. Still warm. Still his. He dropped the blaster, holstered the wrench at his side like a badge. "Guess I'm fixing my way out," he muttered. Then he stepped into the dark corridor, alone, hunted, and smiling. Jace moved fast, keeping low as he slipped through the winding hallways of the Vorten mining frigate. The walls were slick with condensation, humming with energy pulses beneath their metallic veins. Everything about this ship was ugly and unnatural. Panels bolted in odd places, vents too small for proper airflow, lights flickering like a dying carnival. But Jace wasn't here to critique alien architecture. He had one goal now: survive long enough to find a way out, and maybe, if the universe was feeling generous, bend this floating prison to hell. The wrench stayed tight in his grip. It wasn't just a tool anymore. It had become a symbol, a weapon, a reminder that he was still human, still dangerous, and not going quietly. His breath came in tight huffs, heart pounding in his ears. Somewhere behind him, alarms had started wailing in short bursts. Not full red alert. Not yet. But the bodies he'd left behind wouldn't stay hidden forever. Someone would find the mess. Someone would come looking. He ducked into a supply alcove and pressed himself against the wall, watching the hallway from a narrow slit between two crates. A pair of guards stumped past moments later, armored feet clanging on the metal flooring. They were speaking in their grating, insect-like language, one of them gesturing toward the direction Jace had come from. He waited until their steps faded, then slid out and moved in the opposite direction. The path led him deeper into the ship, toward the engineering wing if his instincts were right. Back on Earth, Jace had rewired everything from fighter jets to water heaters. And if he had learned one universal truth, it was this: every complex system has a vulnerable heart. A place where one well-placed wrench or wire could cause catastrophic failure. He just needed to find it. He followed the vibrations in the floor, subtle tremors that told him where the power conduits ran thickest. The hum grew louder the deeper he went. After several turns, he reached a door marked with alien symbols, glowing faint green. Through the small viewport, he saw a wide chamber filled with massive generators and power lines snaking through the floor and ceiling like a nest of electric vipers. He tapped the panel beside the door. Locked. Of course. The aliens weren't complete idiots. Jace glanced around, then pried off the access plate using the corner of his wrench. Inside, the wiring was tight and intricate, not unlike Earth's high-voltage control boards. He used a sliver of scrap metal from his pocket to jump two contacts and grounded a third wire with the back of the wrench. The panel sparked, smoked, then the door hissed open with a reluctant groan. Inside the engineering bay, the noise was deafening. Machinery roared with a rhythmic pulse, a mechanical heartbeat that fed the entire vessel. A few Vorten technicians moved along catwalks above, their backs turned, absorbed in readings and diagnostics. Jace stayed low, slipping between turbine stacks and beneath large coolant tanks. He crouched near a control terminal and surveyed the area. The fusion core glowed faintly at the center of the room, encased in transparent alloy, rotating gently as stabilizer rings flickered around it. That was his mark. If he could just get access to the coolant loops or pulse regulators, he could overload it without triggering failsafes. But he wasn't alone. A sudden hiss echoed to his left. He turned, wrench raised, but froze when he saw who it was. Not a Vorten. Not exactly. The figure was short, barely his shoulder height, with thin limbs and a jagged exoskeleton that shimmered under the core light. Her mandibles clicked nervously, and her eyes, compound, but oddly expressive, were locked on him. In one hand, she held a welding torch. In the other, a ragged piece of cloth with a patch that bore the insignia of Earth's UN fleet. Jace blinked. The creature made a soft warble and raised both hands in an unthreatening gesture. Then she stepped aside, revealing a narrow maintenance shaft behind her. She pointed toward it, then gestured to herself, and then to Jace. The message was simple. Come with me. He hesitated only a moment before following her. The shaft was tight and warm, lit by the occasional flicker of emergency strips. They crawled in silence for several minutes until the space opened into a small, hollowed-out chamber nestled between structural beams. It wasn't much: bare walls, some storage crates, and a makeshift cot made from insulation and wiring. The alien knelt beside a small device and tapped it twice. A hologram flickered to life. It showed Earth, more specifically, footage of an Earth outpost being raided by Vorten soldiers. The timestamp was recent. Very recent. She turned to him, eyes unreadable, and said one word in a glitchy translator voice. Help. Jace stared at her. She wasn't Vorten. Her shell was thinner, her movements different. A separate species, enslaved maybe, forced to work aboard this vessel. That would explain the human patch, the tech scraps, the way she'd risked exposing herself to warn him. He leaned back, exhaled slowly, and gave her a nod. Name? He asked, tapping his chest and then pointing to her. She blinked, then replied, Kretek. Jace smirked. Figures. Even her name sounded like a busted fan motor. He spent the next hour working with her, rigging up a crude map of the ship using scavenged wire and interface nodes. Kretek had a photographic memory of the layout, even though she clearly wasn't allowed to leave the lower decks. Together they pinpointed the ship's coolant override chamber, where the stabilizer regulators were housed. If they could reach it and loop the relay system, the fusion core would heat until the safety systems failed. It wouldn't be instant, but it would be irreversible. Before they left, Kretek opened a compartment hidden in the wall and pulled out a small metal case. Inside was a chip the size of a thumbnail, glowing with a faint red pulse. Jace recognized it immediately. Earth tech. Military grade. A data core, probably stolen during one of the raids. She handed it to him with reverence. His breath caught as he realized the insignia on it belonged to a squad he once helped build drones for. The bastards weren't just stealing Earth's parts, they were copying Earth's people. Reverse engineering, the very tools humanity once used to fight back. Jace clenched the wrench tighter. This wasn't just an escape anymore. It was a declaration. The alarms changed tone by the time Jace and Kretek dropped into the maintenance corridor outside the medbay. No longer the confused blare of localized trouble, it had shifted to a system-wide alert. That meant the bodies had been found. The guards were coordinating. Eyes were on every vent, every shaft, every unsecured bulkhead. Jace didn't have the luxury of being stealthy anymore. Now it was speed, pressure, and luck holding this thing together. If they hesitated, they were dead. If they missed one variable in their plan, the ship wouldn't melt down, it would melt them. The medbay was 2 levels above the coolant chamber. Kretek had insisted they stop here first, and now Jace understood why. Her hive sister was still on board, trapped in an alien pod, possibly dying, maybe worse. The hallway they entered was quieter, shielded from the core alarm. Clean white panels replaced the gritty metal they'd seen before. The Vortens treated their medical deck like a lab, a place for experiments, not healing. Jace could see it in the way the doors locked behind them, the faint hum of isolation fields and surgical lasers, set to idle glow. The medbay didn't care about pain. It cared about results. They crept along the outer edge, dodging a floating medical drone that scanned for temperature and movement. Kretek led him through a back route, using a thin filament to disable a biometric scanner. She moved with urgency now, no longer cautious, no longer hesitant. The closer they got, the more the mask of stoic patience slipped from her face. Jace realized then that Kretek wasn't just trying to free his sister. She was trying to rescue what was left of her family. They reached a sealed lab marked in Vorten glyphs. Jace stepped forward, examined the access panel, and frowned. The lock wasn't mechanical or digital. It was organic, grown into the wall, responding to Vorten genetic signatures. He stepped back, looked at Kretek, and shrugged. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped up to the door, pulled out a thin needle from under her arm plating, and jammed it into the fleshy seam of the lock. The door spasmed, trembled, and hissed open. Inside was worse than Jace expected. The room was cold and humming with machines. In the center, suspended in a clay pod filled with green fluid, was another insectoid figure, larger than Kretek, with patches of armor missing and wires buried deep into her thorax. Her eyes were shut, but her legs twitched every few seconds like she was dreaming or seizing. Screens nearby flashed unfamiliar diagnostics in alien glyphs, but Jace recognized enough shapes to guess. Nerve splicing. Cybernetic bridging. The Vortens were turning her into something else. Or trying to. Kretek moved to the console and started shutting systems down. Jace turned his attention to the surgical armature above the pod. There were tools on it he recognized, Earth surgical attachments, repurposed, fused with Vorten implements. There was no logic to it, just layers of experimentation. They weren't building a cyborg. They were treating her like a test subject, a prototype. Rage bubbled low in his gut. He stepped to the side panel and popped it open with a wrench. Inside was a web of wiring and 2 fuses that clearly didn't belong. He traced the signal, followed the power lines to a stabilization loop, and grunted. They had bypassed safety entirely. The only thing keeping the pod stable was a patched coolant line rerouted through a converter. One mistake and the whole tank would boil. Jace gritted his teeth, reached into his back pocket, and pulled out a coil of stripped copper wire he'd salvaged from the engine room. He wrapped one end around a grounding bolt, looped the other through a regulator chip, then pressed it against the power node. The lights flickered. The fluid began to drain. Kretek rushed forward as the tank unlocked with a wet hiss. She caught her sister just before she fell, cradling her with more gentleness than Jace thought possible from someone made of plates and claws. The sister shuddered, coughed once, and her eyes fluttered open. Kretek warbled something soft. The reply was weaker, but real. Alive. Jace exhaled and turned to check the corridor. That's when the blast door slammed shut. Red lights bathed the room in warning. A low bass hum vibrated the floor, signaling a pressure seal. A voice crackled from overhead speakers, guttural and sharp. Jace didn't know the language, but the tone was clear. They were locked in. Trapped. A security measure. Someone had triggered a total lockdown on the medical wing. Probably remote. Kretek looked up sharply, eyes wide. She motioned to the sister, then toward a ventilation pipe high on the wall. Jace followed her gaze. It was barely wide enough, but maybe, just maybe, they could get through if they ditched their gear. Jace slammed his wrench into the wall beside the vent and ripped away the paneling. Screws bounced off the floor. He jammed his hand inside and started unscrewing the inner grate. Sweat poured down his face. They didn't have time. If the lockdown didn't kill them, the gas that usually followed it would. No security system sealed you in just to keep you cozy. The vent popped loose. Jace climbed halfway in, then reached down to haul Kretek's sister upward while Kretek boosted from below. The vent groaned under their weight. He squeezed forward, dragging them inch by inch, until the path curved sharply and opened above a utility room. They dropped down one by one, coughing, shaking, but alive. They didn't speak. There was no time. Jace pulled the access map back up and pointed toward the coolant chamber. Kretek nodded once and helped her sister to her feet. As they moved, Jace couldn't help but glance at the case strapped to his belt. The data chip. Earth military grade, full of something he didn't yet understand. And yet it burned against his skin like it was daring him to look, to remember, to fight. He knew the ship wouldn't go down easy. Vorten frigates were armored to withstand plasma sieges, asteroid impacts, and EMP barrages. But nothing, not even alien engineering, was built to survive sabotage from the inside. Not when the saboteur knew every bolt, every circuit, every vulnerable link like it was part of his own bloodstream. They reached the corridor outside the coolant regulators just as the next alarm wave rolled through. This time, the alert wasn't mechanical. It was primal. There were footsteps. Dozens of them. Boots. Claws. The sound of reinforcements moving in. Jace tightened his grip on the wrench and cracked his neck once. One corridor. One more override. One last chance. He didn't need to say a word. They were ready. The corridor felt longer than it should have, the kind of stretch that tricks your senses, stretches seconds into hours. Jace kept his body low, his hand locked tight around the wrench, every nerve in his system screaming at him to move faster. Kretek and her sister followed behind, one limping, one shielding. There was no time to rest, no time to breathe. The coolant chamber was just beyond the double bulkhead doors ahead, and if his calculations were right, they had maybe 5 minutes before those footsteps behind him closed in. He reached the panel and peeled the casing back like opening a can, fingers digging past layers of insulation and security wire. The coolant control system was older than he expected, a hybrid mix of Vorten wiring and something disturbingly familiar. Earth tech, probably scavenged from an old satellite or derelict human ship. Jace almost laughed. Even out here, they were building their superiority out of stolen parts. He found the primary regulator, a thick black tube funneling blue coolant through the ship's fusion core. Surrounding it were 3 thermal dampeners, each protected by pressure-locked magnetic couplings. If he could disable just one, the system would overcompensate, causing a chain reaction as the fusion core tried to correct the imbalance. If he disabled 2, the ship would start cooking itself from the inside out. All 3, and it wouldn't be a meltdown, it would be a detonation. But it wouldn't be fast. That was the catch. The cascade would take time, and in that time, every Vorten soldier on board would be converging on this room, all of them armed, all of them angry, and none of them aware that Jace Keller wasn't just some dote hands earth mechanic anymore. He was a walking demolition blueprint. He looked at Kretek. She nodded. Her sister slumped against the wall behind her, too weak to help, but still alert. Jace got to work. The first coupling snapped under the torque of his wrench, the hiss of escaping gas shooting upward like a scream. He moved to the second, fingers slick with sweat, the bolt tighter than expected. He grit his teeth and leaned into it. It finally gave with a metallic pop that nearly unbalanced him. A sudden noise behind him froze his spine. Boot steps. Heavy ones. Close. Jace looked back. The corridor lights dimmed. From the shadows stepped the commander. He was larger than the others, clad in segmented armor that shifted with his movements like living metal. His eyes glowed faintly behind the mask, and his voice, when it came, was low and mocking. "You kill my men with a tool. You think you are dangerous." Jace stood slowly, the wrench still in his hand. He didn't speak. Words were wasted on people like this. The commander stepped closer. "You are filth. You build, you fix, but you are not a warrior. You are the bottom of your species. That is why you are here." Jace tilted his head. "That right? Funny. Where I come from, guys like me are the ones who make sure the rest of you don't blow yourselves up trying to work a toaster." The commander moved fast, almost too fast. Jace barely raised his wrench in time to block the first strike, a backhand that would have shattered his ribs. The wrench caught the blow, vibrated through his bones, and sent him sprawling across the chamber floor. The commander was already moving again, stepping over coolant lines, his blade unfolding from his gauntlet like a scythe. Jace rolled and sprang to his feet, swinging the wrench low and hard. It connected with the commander's leg, enough to stagger him. Not enough to stop him. The blade lashed out and cut through Jace's jumpsuit, grazing his side with a shallow burn that felt like fire. He grunted, stumbled, and ducked under another swing. Kretek lunged from behind, hurling a jagged piece of metal into the commander's side. It glanced off the armor, but the distraction bought Jace the second he needed. He feinted left, then drove forward, jamming the wrench into a gap between plates in the commander's shoulder joint. The alien roared, flinging Jace backward. Jace hit the wall hard, vision flashing white. Blood in his mouth, his side burning, ooze ringing. He blinked, staggered back up. The commander advanced again, slower now, the wound leaking black fluid down his side. "You will die here," the commander said, voice steady despite the damage. "Maybe," Jace muttered, "but not before I do what I came here to do." He reached back, slamming the wrench down on the third coupling. There was a moment of silence. Then a pulse rippled through the floor. The coolant system let out a deep groan, and the fusion core above began to spin faster, its internal lights flickering from blue to red. Steam burst from 2 separate pipes, and the temperature began to climb rapidly. The commander paused, realizing what had just happened. "You would destroy us all." Jace spat blood onto the floor. "Welcome to Earth logic." The commander lunged again, this time wild with fury. Jace didn't dodge. He stepped into it, driving the wrench upward with every ounce of strength left in his body. The steel bit deep, piecing through the soft joint under the commander's chin and up into the base of his skull. The alien froze, gurgled, and collapsed like a Feld machine. Jace dropped to his knees beside the body, chest heaving. The room was now pulsing red with warning lights. The fusion core's hum became a scream. The ship was going to die, and it was going to take everyone on board with it unless they moved. Kretek was already at the exit, helping her sister up. Jace staggered after them, wrench still in hand, feet barely finding grip. They ran down side corridors, past flickering lights and hissing vents, turning corners based only on Kretek's memory of the layout. Each second the heat grew worse, the pressure pushing against their ears, the metal groaning like the ship itself was in pain. They reached the hangar just as the first explosion rocked the deck behind them. Shuttles lined the walls, most of them sealed or busted. Kretek pointed to one on the far end, a scout vessel. Small, fast, unarmed. Perfect. Jace broke the access panel with the wrench and started hot-wiring the ignition as the deck behind them cracked open, flames spewing from torn panels. Kretek's sister collapsed in the cabin as he fired the engines. The hangar doors began to shut automatically. He gunned the throttle, slammed a hand on the launch pad, and the scout shuttle screamed forward just before the bay doors sealed behind them. The frigate exploded seconds later. Not in a fireball, but in a slow bloom of molten debris, torn metal, and fractured engine core spilling into space like a dying sun. Inside the shuttle, Jace leaned back, chest rising and falling like a jackhammer. Kretek sat across from him, silent, her sister wrapped in emergency mesh. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Jace reached into his belt, pulled out the wrench, and laid it across his lap. "Still works," he muttered. The stars outside didn't answer, but they didn't need to. The stars blurred past as the shuttle's engine stabilized into cruise, its thrusters humming with a low, steady vibration that seemed to echo through Jace's bones. He sat slouched against the wall of the small cabin, his eyes fixed on the metal ceiling above, breathing in short, shallow bursts. Every inch of his body ached. His side was wrapped in makeshift bandages torn from emergency mesh, and his knuckles were still stained with dried alien blood. Across from him, Kretek sat quietly, her gaze drifting between her sister's sleeping form and the console lights flickering beside her. She hadn't spoken since they left the wreckage of the Vorten frigate behind. She didn't have to. The silence between them was a language now. Shared survival didn't need translation. Jace tilted his head and looked out the side viewport. The debris field from the ship they'd just destroyed drifted in the distance, glowing softly in the black void. Large chunks of fractured hull spun in slow spirals, some still shedding sparks, others floating aimlessly like cosmic litter. Somewhere in that mess was the body of the commander, buried under the weight of his own arrogance. Jace took a breath and let it out slowly. He hadn't expected to live through that. Honestly, he hadn't planned to. But now that he had, the gravity of it settled on him like cold iron. He reached down and picked up the wrench resting near his boot. It was heavier now, not because of the metal but because of the memory forged into it. It had broken bones, pried open locks, reconfigured circuits, and ended a life that threatened far more than his own. He turned it slowly in his hand, staring at the tiny scratched smiley face on the handle, the mark he had etched long ago during one of the quiet days when he still thought he'd live and die under the hood of a pickup truck. Kretek shifted and tapped the console with one claw. A map of local space appeared, highlighting nearby systems and known traffic routes. They had limited fuel and barely functioning communication equipment. The ship wasn't meant for long-haul escape. It was a scout shuttle, fast and lean, and built for short bursts and reconnaissance. If they didn't find a safe port soon, the systems would fail, and they'd drift until they ran out of air. Jace stared at the blinking display, trying to piece together the chart symbols. Kretek leaned over and pointed at one of the nearby sectors, her finger tapping against a pulsing star near the edge of the display. She looked at him and nodded once. "That's where we go," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then he reached forward and input the coordinates manually. The shuttle shuddered slightly as it corrected course, its nose tilting toward the new heading. A faint rumble of acceleration passed beneath their feet. A soft sound behind him made him turn. Kretek's sister stirred, her eyes fluttering open for the first time since they'd escaped. She looked around groggily, confusion settling across her features before recognition set in. Her mandibles twitched, and her gaze landed on Jace. She spoke something in her language, soft and hoarse, and Kretek responded quickly, her voice low and urgent. Jace didn't know what they were saying, but it felt like thanks. Maybe not in words, but in tone. In the way Kretek's sister looked at him, not with fear or suspicion, but with a calm sort of awe, like she was trying to make sense of why someone like him, a dirty, scarred human with nothing but a wrench and a bad attitude, had risked everything to save someone not even from his species. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the data chip, the one Kretek had given him in the coolant chamber. He turned it over in his palm, studying the faint red pulse glowing from its center. The insignia was still there, worn but unmistakable. It had belonged to Earth's military, probably from a downed reckoned satellite or a stolen fleet drone. Jace had once worked on systems that interfaced with tech like this, back when Earth still had borders and armies and hope. This chip contained something valuable. Maybe data. Maybe protocols. Maybe blueprints that the Vortons had tried to understand but failed to replicate. Whatever it was going back where it belonged. He leaned forward and slid the chip into the shuttle's backup console. The screen flashed, then stabilized as it accessed the drive. Code streamed across the interface, Earth standard. Fragmented, partially corrupted, but still alive. Jace watched as the system automatically pinged for familiar networks. It was a long shot, but maybe, just maybe, someone out there was still listening. The console beeped once. A faint signal pulsed back. Jace froze. It was faint, barely there, but it was real. A ping from a human relay satellite, still in orbit, still functioning. He grinned, a slow, exhausted grin that pulled at the bruises on his face. "We're not alone out here," he said softly. Then he looked at Kretek and her sister and nodded. "And neither are you." The ship continued toward the new coordinates, its engines running steady for now. They still had a long way to go. Supplies were low, fuel even lower. But Jace didn't care. They had momentum, and more importantly, they had purpose. He could feel something shifting, not just in his own bones, but in the space around them. The galaxy had seen a lot of war, a lot of conquest, but maybe it hadn't seen someone like him. A man with a wrench and no patience for tyrants. He stood slowly and walked to the back of the shuttle, opened a small panel beside the engineering console, and pulled out a toolkit. He began rearranging wires, tightening connections, reinforcing power lines with bits of scrap. Not because it needed to be done immediately, but because that's what he did. He fixed things. He made broken things run better. And this ship, like everything else around him, was going to survive whether it liked it or not. After a while, Kretek joined him, helping without words, handing him tools and pointing out flaws in the structure. They worked in quiet tandem, two survivors from different worlds, building something new from the wreckage of the old. Hours passed. The stars outside shifted as they crossed into the outer boundary of the system Kretek had chosen. The console chirped again. Planet detected. Habitable zone. No Vorton presence detected. Jace looked over at the two of them, tired but alive, scarred but free. He placed the wrench into the toolkit, shut the lid, and latched it tight. Then he smiled, leaned back in the seat, and whispered to no one in particular. "This one's for Earth.